in a literal sense. You're writing for white people. Are you aware of that?
I'm writing for people, baby. No, I don't believe in white people. I don't believe in black people either, for that matter. But I know the difference between being black and white at this time. It means that I cannot fool myself about some things that I could fool myself about if I were white. I must point out, though, too, that I've been working in the last few years between assassinations. That doesn't make it any easier either. I mean, they're killing my friends. It's as simple as that.
For thousands of years, America has always sold itself as the land of freedom. But in truth, that promise was built on stolen lives and broken backs. It called itself a democracy while it hunted, jailed, and silenced the very people who made its wealth possible. Out of this contradiction came James Baldwin, an exceptionally talented man who simply refused to be silenced. This man saw the myths that tried to cover up cruelty, the lies that allowed injustice to thrive, and he stripped them bare in a way that most people are not capable of doing.
If we were white, if we were Irish, if we were Jewish, if we were Poles, if we had, in fact, in your mind, a frame of reference, our heroes would be your heroes too. Nat Turner would be a hero for you instead of a threat. Malcolm X might still be alive. When the Israelis pick up guns, or the Poles, or the Irish, or any white man in the world says, "Give me liberty or give me death," the entire white world applauds. When a black man says exactly the same thing, word for word, he is judged a criminal and treated like one, and everything possible is done to make an example of this bad man so there won't be any more like him.
This is not a story of comfort. Baldwin's life was a battle with the nation's conscience, and his legacy proves that silence was never an option.
One of the great things that the white world does not know, but I think I do know, is that black people are just like everybody else. One has used the myth of Negro and the myth of color to pretend and to assume that you are dealing essentially with something exotic, bizarre, and practically, according to human laws, unknown. Alas, it is not true. We are also mercenaries, dictators, murderers, liars. We are human too.
We are human too. Entire, flawed, brilliant, dangerous, tender, human. And the lie that America told about blackness was meant to strip away humanity and protect those in power. James Baldwin knew this, and that clip is only a small glimpse of the large wound he dared to expose. So if you're ready to walk into the fire of history and feel its heat for yourself, then stay with us, because Baldwin's story burns through every illusion this country ever told. And before we head into it, subscribe so you never look away when the fire of truth rises again.
When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those are the only books there were.
What happens to a child when every book he touches tells him his skin is a curse? To be told your whole life that you come from nowhere, that your people have no story, is to be stripped of the very right to exist with pride. Baldwin, like so many other black children, carried that wound, a wound that would fester as his life gets burdened with hardships imposed by the nation itself. While the Great Depression was crushing millions of families, James Baldwin was born in Harlem Hospital on August 2nd, 1924. His mother, Emma Burtis Jones, had fled the South with hope clutched tight, believing distance from Jim Crow would mean freedom. Yet Harlem offered no refuge, only overcrowded blocks, landlords fattened on desperation, and streets where dignity cost more than anyone could pay. Baldwin, the eldest of 9, had no corner of childhood untouched by struggle. Each room in their apartment was a lesson of how dreams suffocate when air is thin and how hunger grows louder than lullabies. So even as a child, Baldwin already saw what many others refused to acknowledge, that America's grand promises dangled just out of reach for anyone born black, like bait meant to be chased but never caught.
My father came from New Orleans. My mother came from Maryland. And if they had waited, 2 more seconds, I might have been born in the South. The first house I remember was on Park Avenue, which is not the American Park Avenue, or maybe it is the American Park Avenue.
Uptown Park Avenue.
Uptown Park Avenue, where the railroad tracks are. We used to play on the roof, and I can't call it an alley, but near the river. It was a kind of dump, garbage dump. Those were the first things I remember. I remember my father had trouble keeping us alive. There were 9 of us, and I was the oldest, so I took care of the kids and dealt with Daddy. I understand much better now. Part of his problem was he couldn't feed his kids. But I was a kid and I didn't know that. And he was very religious, very rigid.
The Baldwin home was no sanctuary. James's stepfather, David Baldwin, gripped the pulpit with one hand and the Bible with the other, wielding both as instruments of control. He demanded obedience, instilled rigid religiosity, and carried a deep mistrust of white society. He even forbade young James from reading books or watching movies, seeing such interests as morally dangerous influences from the white world. Unfortunately for him, his stepson turned out to be a curious and sensitive boy who loved to read and showed early talent for writing. James read in secret and wrote whenever he could, treating every word as resistance against his stepfather. The two clashed constantly over James's ideas, beliefs, and even friendships as young James formed bonds with white children his stepfather despised. The anger of David Baldwin left him with wounds, but those wounds gave James something lasting. He learned that keeping quiet meant surrender, and surrender was not an option. The streets outside became his other teacher. Harlem pulsed with jazz and voices that stretched into the night, yet under the music lived hunger, humiliation, and despair. Baldwin labored to support his mother when David's sickness robbed the family of income. For the sake of survival, he swallowed the daily insults of white supervisors at a New Jersey defense plant. And as he toiled away, boys his own age slipped into the open jaws of drugs, crime, or resignation. Lives shut down before they began. Later, he would admit he never really had a childhood because poverty and racism had stolen it from him. But Baldwin refused to be crushed. At 14, under the stern guidance of his stepfather, he joined the Pentecostal church in Harlem, the Fireside Pentecostal Assembly. Little did he know that what began as pressure to follow the path of holiness would become his own discovery of language as power. As a teenage preacher, he stunned congregations with fire and rhythm. His sermons carried a force far beyond his age, filled with urgency that left even adults in silence. However, Baldwin soon realized that the pulpit could not save him. Behind his powerful sermons, he wrestled with questions that faith alone could not answer. Questions about race, justice, and identity that no scripture seemed willing to confront. The very stage that gave him a voice also showed him its boundaries. By 17, he walked away from the church, and the library became his second refuge. There, he found books no ban could keep from him, pages that spoke truths the church would not utter. Writers like Dickens, Dostoevsky, and Harriet Beecher Stowe pulled his imagination beyond Harlem's walls, showing him a world where language could strike deeper than any sermon. In those quiet aisles, Baldwin discovered that words could be both shield and weapon, carrying him further than the pulpit ever could. It was then that guidance arrived, just when he needed it most. At his high school, Orilla Miller, a young white teacher who recognized his brilliance, slipped him books that broadened his vision and opened doors to theater he might never have entered. Soon after, Baldwin crossed paths with Count Cullen, the celebrated Harlem Renaissance poet who taught at Frederick Douglass Junior High, where Baldwin was a student. Cullen's presence alone proved that Black voices could carve permanent marks into literature. Together, these mentors told Baldwin something he already suspected. His hunger for words was not a mistake, but a destiny. By his late teens, the path before him was no longer in doubt. He had seen Harlem's traps, endured his father's harsh discipline, and felt racism's open cruelty. With a heavy heart, he asked himself, why was no one doing anything? Someone had to break the silence, yet when he looked around, no one stepped forward. So it fell to him. Baldwin would not wait, not while the wrongs of white society grew heavier with each passing year. He felt it in his chest. If no one else would speak, then the responsibility, however dangerous, was his. That resolve was hammered into permanence by two tragedies. In 1943, his stepfather's illness ended in death. Bitterness, his only inheritance. Days later, on Baldwin's 19th birthday, Harlem exploded in flames as a race riot tore through the streets after another act of police brutality. As he buried his father, Baldwin watched glass shatter and fire spread across his neighborhood. Grief for one life merged with rage for many. He understood in that instant that his father's fury was not his alone. It was the reflection of an entire community suffocated by the same chains. 3 years later, in Greenwich Village, Baldwin suffered a second loss that pierced even deeper. Amid the artists and writers of the bohemian world, he had found a companion, Eugene Worth, a young man whose dreams mirrored his own and whose presence carried the quiet intimacy of unspoken love. The two shared a unique bond, the kind of bond that, once you felt, you'd hope would last forever. But such bonds found no mercy in the 1940s America, and least of all if you were black. In 1946, Eugene leapt from the George Washington Bridge, ending his life. Baldwin was left completely broken, his grief hardened into a vow. He would never again hide who he was, never again mask his pain, never again let silence be mistaken for safety. His writing would bear everything: race, rage, love, and loss, because the cost of suppression had already stolen too much. From then on, Baldwin wrote openly about race, sexuality, and identity, subjects that mainstream society insisted be hidden. He knew that silence was deadly and truth the only antidote. By his early 20s, Baldwin reached a breaking point. America offered no safe space for someone like him, black, ambitious, queer, outspoken. Staying meant risking violence in the streets or the slow death of his spirit. So in 1948, at 24, he bought a one-way ticket to Paris. He carried almost nothing: a typewriter, a few dollars, and a determination that burned hotter than fear. Boarding that plane, Baldwin left behind the land of his birth for an uncertain future abroad. His departure was both escape and emancipation, a final break from the trap of color that had defined his youth. With Harlem's voices echoing in his mind and the lessons of survival carved into his bones, he set out to turn those experiences into words that would one day shake the conscience of the world. James Baldwin arrived in Paris in 1948 with little more than conviction. The city, alive with artists, radicals, and wanderers, gave him a freedom he had never known. In America, he was always first seen as a black man and then judged accordingly. In Paris, at least for a time, he could move without that crushing weight. Here he was not simply a black writer, but a writer, and that distinction gave him room to breathe. Though he lived in poverty, often pawning his clothes to eat, he felt alive. Paris gave him anonymity, and in that space he began to see his homeland more clearly. The cafes and bookstalls of the left bank became Baldwin's classrooms. He joined circles of expatriate artists, talked endlessly in crowded bars, and sharpened his ideas about identity, power, and art. He met Richard Wright, the celebrated novelist who had first inspired him, though their friendship soured when Baldwin dared to criticize Wright's work. But such willingness to confront even his idols showed Baldwin's deepest commitment. Truth mattered more than loyalty. In Europe, Baldwin met colonial subjects from Africa and the Caribbean, men and women who carried stories of empire's brutality on their backs. Listening to them, he realized oppression was not confined to America. It stretched across oceans, linking Harlem to Dakar, Mississippi to Martinique. Exile sharpened his perspective. From Paris cafes and smoky left bank bars, he looked back at the United States with unclouded eyes. The distance gave him clarity, and with that clarity came urgency. He began shaping his wounds into literature that demanded to be heard. His first breakthrough came in 1953 with Go Tell It on the Mountain, a semi-autobiographical novel about a Harlem boy wrestling with family, faith, and the crushing weight of black life. The book struck critics like a thunderclap. Here was proof that the voice of a poor black boy from Harlem could carry the gravity of scripture and command respect across the globe. 2 years later, Notes of a Native Son confirmed it. In those essays, Baldwin fused memoir with unflinching critique, dissecting the bitterness racism leaves behind and exposing the jagged contradictions at the heart of American democracy. Baldwin was no longer just a novelist, he had become a moral witness. Then in 1956, he risked everything with Giovanni's Room, a love story between two men in Paris. The novel confronted homosexuality with a candor almost unthinkable for its time. Baldwin knew what was at stake. White publishers warned it would end his career. Black readers feared it would overshadow his voice on race. But Baldwin refused to lie. He would not amputate one part of his truth to preserve another. The novel proceeded to become a breakthrough in queer literature. By the late 1950s, Baldwin was acclaimed on both sides of the Atlantic, but the storm of the civil rights movement was rising back home. From Paris, he followed the murder of Emmett Till, the Montgomery bus boycott, the defiant marches and clashes over school desegregation. Distance was no longer enough. He felt history pulling him back. He knew he had to stand where the fire was burning. In 1957, Baldwin returned to the South and stepped into a crucible. He saw black children walk through mobs just to enter a classroom. He stood in Charlotte and Little Rock where integration battles raged. In Atlanta, he was introduced to Martin Luther King Jr. through mutual friends in the movement. Baldwin had admired King from afar, but meeting him in person revealed the weight King carried. The calm determination of a leader mixed with the exhaustion of a man under constant threat. In Mississippi, he walked the streets with Medgar Evers, breathing in the atmosphere of terror and courage. Baldwin saw how segregation sought not only to chain bodies, but to shatter spirits. And he knew he had to bear witness. His reporting turned into essays that carried the immediacy of frontline dispatches, capturing the tension, the bravery, and the cost of a movement that refused to bow. This period also marked Baldwin's transformation into a public intellectual of international stature. His essays circulated widely, his voice appeared on radio and television, and he spoke to audiences across the world about America's racial crisis. He had left Harlem seeking freedom, but in exile, he had found his calling, to hold America accountable. Baldwin declared that racism was not a regional quirk of the South, but the foundation of the entire nation. He argued that until white Americans confronted their history of violence, the country would remain haunted by its lies. His decision to return placed him in peril. He was outspoken, openly gay, and politically radical in a country that punished all three. Yet Baldwin accepted the risk. Harlem had given him scars, Paris had sharpened his vision, and now he was ready to walk directly into the storm of civil rights America. Exile had given Baldwin perspective, a wider horizon, and the courage to write without compromise. Paris stripped away illusions, forcing him to confront his own identity while showing him how oppression connected across continents. From that distance, he learned how to speak back to his country with clarity. By the time he set foot on American soil again, Baldwin was no longer the uncertain young man who had fled. He returned as a writer armed with vision and a mission to expose America's truth. In the 1960s, James Baldwin became an indispensable voice of the civil rights era. Few writers of any race spoke with the clarity, passion, and prophetic fury that Baldwin brought to the national conversation on race. As protests against segregation and racism swept across the American South, Baldwin was there, not as a marcher on the front lines, but as a journalist, essayist, and speaker whose eloquence galvanized many. He felt it was his duty as a writer to bear witness, as he often said, to tell what he saw and demand the country reckon with its truths. Baldwin traveled extensively through the segregated South, a black man from Harlem witnessing life under Jim Crow. He visited Atlanta, where he met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the midst of the bus boycott and heard King's vision of justice firsthand. He sat in church pews and across kitchen tables with ordinary black families who daily risked their lives to challenge white oppressors. In Montgomery, Alabama, Baldwin walked into diners where hostile glares from white patrons greeted him, and signs still dictated where black people could enter. In Mississippi, he spent time with the brave NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers, who guided him through neighborhoods terrorized by Ku Klux Klan violence. Baldwin later wrote that the palpable fear he observed among black Mississippians, the way their voices hushed and eyes watched the door, reminded him of how German Jews must have talked when Hitler came to power. The specter of terror was that real. These trips were dangerous. A black northerner asking questions always drew suspicion. Baldwin knew he was being followed at times, and the FBI opened a file on him, branding him a subversive. Yet he persisted, notebook in hand, collecting the stories and spirits of a people fighting for their freedom. The experiences Baldwin gathered in the South poured into some of his most influential writing. In 1963, at the height of the movement, he published The Fire Next Time, a compact book that detonated like a moral bomb in American culture. It consisted of two profound essays. The first was framed as a letter to his young nephew, laying out the bitter inheritance of being black in America and expressing a fierce hope for a better future. The second essay, Down at the Cross, recounted Baldwin's meeting with the Nation of Islam's Elijah Muhammad and grappled with the role of religion in both oppression and liberation. Here Baldwin's voice burned hottest. He admonished white America with a prophecy: if we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in song by a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. The Fire Next Time became a bestseller and made Baldwin, seemingly overnight, the most famous black writer in America. He was featured on the cover of Time magazine that year as a face of the civil rights struggle. Readers across the country, black and white alike, were stunned by his eloquence and the unsettling truth of his message. Baldwin wrote, "Color is not a human or a personal reality. It is a political reality," calling out the artificial constructs that sustained racism. America, he argued, was living a lie in pretending to be the land of the free while keeping black citizens in subjugation. And if that lie was not exposed and dismantled, the country would be doomed to a kind of spiritual death. This was Baldwin's prophecy, delivered with a mix of outrage and love for what his country could be. It hit a nerve. The Fire Next Time cemented Baldwin's status as one of the foremost public intellectuals in the nation. People who had never read his novels now knew him for his searing essays. He became a sought-after lecturer and talk show guest, using every platform he could to speak about America's racial dilemma. At the same time, Baldwin was moving quietly inside some of the most critical, behind-the-scenes moments of the civil rights struggle. In 1963, not long after the horrific bombing of a black church in Birmingham that killed 4 young girls, Baldwin arranged a face-to-face meeting between U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and a group of black activists and artists. Baldwin gathered a formidable delegation: playwright Lorraine Hansberry, actor Rip Torn, singer Harry Belafonte, and others, and put them in the same room with the president's brother. The group confronted the Kennedy administration about its sluggish and hesitant response to Southern violence. The conversation was tense, at times searing. Baldwin and his peers pleaded for Kennedy to grasp the urgency and desperation fueling black protest, warning that polite speeches meant little while children were being murdered in churches. Yet despite their pleas, the group left frustrated. They felt the administration, and by extension President John F. Kennedy's White House, failed to understand the fierce urgency of the crisis, what Dr. King would call the fierce urgency of now. Baldwin walked away convinced that those in power were dangerously detached from the blood and grief in the streets. The meeting did not yield immediate policy change, but it crystallized Baldwin's role as a bridge, carrying the voices of Black America into the halls of power, forcing officials to confront a reality they preferred to ignore. Kennedy reportedly bristled at Baldwin's boldness, but history would vindicate Baldwin's insistence that polite gradualism was intolerable in the face of racial terror. That same year, 1963, saw the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Dr. King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Baldwin attended the march, deeply moved by the sight of hundreds of thousands gathered for change. However, despite Baldwin's prominence, the organizers of the march did not invite him to be one of the official speakers. The reason was a painful reminder of the prejudices even within the movement. Baldwin was openly gay, and some leaders feared that his presence might offend conservative allies or distract from the message. It was an ironic slight. A man who spoke so stirringly for justice was sidelined because of who he loved. Baldwin was disappointed, but not bitter. He understood the pressures the organizers faced. Still, It highlighted his unique position. He stood at multiple intersections of identity, as a black man and a gay man, demanding equality for all. If some in the black leadership were not ready to embrace the fullness of Baldwin's identity, he would push on regardless. In fact, Baldwin increasingly spoke out on behalf of LGBTQ people in the years that followed, condemning homophobia with the same clarity he condemned racism. His conscience would not allow any form of bigotry to pass unchallenged. As Baldwin's fame and influence grew, so did the backlash. By the late 1960s, more militant voices had risen within the black community, and some took aim at Baldwin. Eldridge Cleaver of the Black Panther Party accused him of being too lenient toward white America, and even hurled vicious homophobic attacks in an effort to discredit him. The insults wounded Baldwin, but they did not stop him. If anything, his writing in the late 1960s and early 1970s became sharper, infused with the urgency of those turbulent years and responsive to some of the militants' critiques about the depth of American racism. Still, he refused to be boxed in by any party line or political dogma. Baldwin understood the rage of Black Power activists, and he shared their outrage at the cruelty of racism, but he rejected violence and separatism as the only answers. This independence often left him isolated, too unflinching about white supremacy for many white Americans, yet unwilling to condemn the nation in the absolute terms that some black radicals demanded. Baldwin stood in the space between his voice at once outraged and compassionate, calling America to account. As always, he insisted on being his own Ma. And it wasn't just activists who pushed back. By the late 1960s, the mainstream publishing world began to lose some interest in Baldwin's work. The literary fashion shifted, and Baldwin, once the darling of liberal white audiences, was now seen by some critics as preaching the same sermon too often. He struggled at times to get his work published or reviewed with the seriousness it deserved. Time magazine, which had lauded him in 1963, declined to even publish an essay from him later in the decade. But Baldwin kept writing and speaking regardless of the changing winds of popularity. He knew that the struggle he spoke of was far from over. Indeed, the later 1960s proved devastating. He lost several of his personal friends and heroes to assassins' bullets. Medgar Evers, whom Baldwin had visited and admired, was shot dead in Mississippi in 1963. Malcolm X, whom Baldwin had debated and respected as a fellow truth-teller, was gunned down in 1965. Martin Luther King Jr., with whom Baldwin had marched and to whom he felt deeply connected, was killed in 1968. Each death shook Baldwin's soul. He mourned, he raged, and he poured his grief into words. In 1964, Baldwin wrote an elegiac essay, Nothing Personal, and in 1972, he published No Name in the Street, a book-length essay reflecting on the betrayals and tragedies of the 1960s. In it, Baldwin recounts his experiences during those tumultuous years and laments how America had no name for the evil it continued to perpetrate against black people. Writing about Martin Luther King Jr., Baldwin described the depth of the loss in words both tender and anguished. He said, "Something has gone away. Perhaps even more than the death itself, the manner of his death has forced me into a judgment concerning human life and human beings." Baldwin admitted that King's assassination left him unable to share the optimism many Americans claimed to feel about progress. King's death, he wrote, was a wound that revealed how little the nation had changed, despite all its laws and speeches. But even as he was grieving and reflecting, Baldwin continued to engage actively with movements for justice. He lent his name and presence to causes and rallies whenever asked. Baldwin also reached out to the younger generation of black activists. He met members of the Black Panther Party, and contrary to what some might have expected, he expressed solidarity with much of their platform. He understood their militancy as a response to centuries of violence. Baldwin did not advocate violence, but he was unapologetic about supporting black people's right to defend themselves. During the Vietnam War, Baldwin spoke out strongly against the conflict, seeing it as an extension of imperialistic racism. He connected the dots between the oppression of black Americans at home and the oppression of people of color abroad in war. In all these ways, Baldwin's political commitments in the late 60s deepened. He never ceased to hold America accountable, even as the country moved into the more conservative 1970s. The victories of the civil rights movement were real, but James Baldwin knew they were fragile. As the 1970s opened, he carried both grief and determination. He had seen friends assassinated, laws passed, and progress proclaimed. Yet racism had not disappeared. It had only adapted. Baldwin entered this new era as an elder witness, refusing to let America rest on false laurels. He insisted that prejudice was still alive, wearing new disguises, and that Black survival demanded continued vigilance. In a 1979 address at Berkeley, Baldwin warned that the progress of the 1960s was being reversed. He described poverty, police brutality, and the deliberate efforts to push Black people back into their place. He cautioned that people left with nothing to lose could not be contained forever. His voice, gravelly and urgent, commanded silence. Those who heard him knew he was not predicting chaos for drama's sake. He was pointing out what America refused to see. Baldwin also confronted issues of sexuality and identity with the same fearlessness he brought to race. At a time when the gay rights movement was still young, he stood as a visible, unapologetic Black gay intellectual. He refused to compartmentalize his identity. For Baldwin, liberation meant facing all forms of oppression at once. He challenged homophobia inside Black communities and racism within gay communities, demanding a fuller vision of justice. Long before the term intersectionality existed, Baldwin embodied it. His life showed that the struggle for freedom could not be divided. In the Reagan years, Baldwin grew more disillusioned with America's political climate. He saw a nation retreating from the gains of the 1960s, celebrating myths of unity while ignoring reality. In Evidence of Things Not Seen, Baldwin examined the Atlanta child murders and revealed how Black lives remained disposable in the eyes of power. He spoke of slavery's shadow still shaping the present. Though older and wearied, Baldwin's voice retained its fire. He was unafraid to confront audiences with the truth that racism was not fading, but shifting into new forms. Despite his criticisms, Baldwin was beloved by many who found in him a guide for survival. Younger activists and artists saw him as a mentor and model. He was respected in Black radical circles, even among those who once criticized him, because he never betrayed the struggle. He remained a bridge between generations, between the US and Europe, between art and activism. By the mid-1980s, Baldwin was living quietly in the south of France in a small house in Saint-Paul-de-Vence. There he hosted friends, taught students, and continued writing. He was only in his early 60s, but decades of smoking, stress, and relentless work had taken a toll. In December 1987, Baldwin died of stomach cancer at the age of 63. The news shook the literary and activist world. At his funeral in New York, thousands came to honor him. Writers like Amiri Baraka, Toni Morrison, and Maya Angelou paid tribute, acknowledging that Baldwin had taught them and the nation how to speak the unspeakable.
He lived his life as witness. He wrote until the end. We hear of the writer's blocks of celebrated Americans, how great they are, so great indeed that their writing fingers have been turned to checks. But Jimmy wrote, he produced, he spoke, he sang. No matter the odds, he remained man and spirit and voice, ever expanding and ever more conscious. Let us hold him in our hearts and minds. Let us make him a part of our invincible Black souls, the intelligence of our transcendence. Let our Black hearts grow big, world-absorbing eyes like his, never closed. Let us one day be able to celebrate him like he must be celebrated if we are ever truly to be self-determining. For Jimmy was God's Black revolutionary mouth, if there is a God, and revolution his righteous natural expression.
By the time of his death, Baldwin had published 17 books, novels, essays, plays, and poems, each a piece of the map he drew for understanding race and humanity. He had lived as an expatriate yet remained deeply American, committed to exposing his country's soul. To those who asked why he cared so much about a nation that had rejected him, Baldwin answered simply, because he loved it enough to tell it the truth. Baldwin's later years proved that bearing witness does not end when the cameras fade. He never stopped exposing the lies of racism, never stopped connecting past to present. Even in exile, he belonged to Harlem, to the South, to every community struggling against oppression. His death ended a voice, but not a legacy. Baldwin's truth lived on, waiting for the next generation to hear it. James Baldwin's passing in 1987 did not silence him. If anything, his words became louder in the years that followed. America had lost one of its most unrelenting witnesses, but his warnings, his love, and his rage remained etched in his books, speeches, and interviews. His legacy was not neat or comfortable. It was raw, jagged, and alive, a fire still burning against the lies of racial prejudice. In the decades after his death, Baldwin's work was rediscovered again and again. The 1990s and early 2000s saw new readers turning to The Fire Next Time and Go Tell It on the Mountain. Teachers assigned Baldwin in classrooms where his voice once would have been forbidden. Activists quoted his words in protests. His essays appeared prophetic, describing exactly the patterns of police brutality, mass incarceration, and racial violence that continued long after the Civil Rights era. To read Baldwin was to realize that America had changed its laws, but not its soul. Baldwin's insistence on confronting race directly made him indispensable in a country built on denial. He argued that racism was not just about personal prejudice, but about power, about a system designed to crush black people while protecting white illusions. His writing forced readers to ask what America really was and whether it could survive its own contradictions. Even now, Baldwin's essays feel urgent because the conditions he described, poverty, fear, inequality, remain everywhere. In the Black Lives Matter movement, Baldwin's presence was unmistakable. Protesters held signs with his words. Writers returned to his essays to explain why police killings and racial terror continued. Baldwin had already mapped the terrain of American hypocrisy, and his guidance gave language to the grief and fury of a new generation. His impact stretched beyond the U.S. as well. In Europe, where he had sought refuge, Baldwin became a model for writers of the African diaspora grappling with colonialism, migration, and identity. His work inspired authors in Africa, the Caribbean, and Britain, proving that the fight against white domination was global. Baldwin's Exile, once seen as merely an escape, became part of his legacy. He belonged everywhere that oppression existed and truth was needed. He diagnosed the American sickness more clearly than any politician or preacher. He exposed the lies that made the nation feel safe. He revealed that beneath every riot, every rebellion, every outburst of rage was a truth America had buried. That truth, he said, was that black people had always been central to the nation's story, its labor, its culture, its survival, and that without justice for them, there could be no America at all. James Baldwin's life was not easy, and neither was his message, but he left behind a body of work that refuses to let us look away. He carried Harlem with him to Paris, to Istanbul, to the world, and he turned his own wounds into wisdom. His legacy is fire, a flame passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, refusing to die. Baldwin lives wherever people demand freedom, wherever truth is spoken against power, wherever love refuses to be silenced. He is gone, but his fire burns on. That fire now belongs to us. To read Baldwin, to hear Baldwin, is to be confronted with the demand to act. The struggle he spoke of is not finished, and the silence he refused is still pressing on us today. So if Baldwin's fire has reached you, don't let it go out. Share this story, leave your thoughts below, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss any more truths they want forgotten. Thank you for joining us in this story of struggle and truth. Until next time, carry the flame.